On the 23rd of September 1991, an elderly man stepped up to the border checkpoint at Tallinn station and extended his passport with a steady hand. The document was genuine, the stamps were authentic, but the name printed inside belonged to a man who had officially ceased to exist 42 years earlier, declared dead in the frozen depths of Vorkutlag, a Soviet labor camp buried deep beyond the Arctic Circle. The border guard accepted the passport, flipped it open, and glanced at the photograph. Then his eyes lifted to study the face before him. What he saw was a 66-year-old Estonian with skin weathered by decades of harsh northern winds, a face carved by time and suffering, and running the entire length of his left cheek, a thick scar, the kind that tells a story without words. That scar had been earned in the Arctic tundra, when temperatures plunged to minus 42 degrees and the nearest human settlement lay more than 1,000 kilometers away. The guard looked back at the passport, then at the man. Something didn't add up. How could the dead return to cross a border? Georgy Tenno stood at the threshold of a free Estonia and felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 46 years, he could speak his true name aloud without the cold terror of arrest. For nearly half a century, that name had been erased, buried, classified. The Soviet state security apparatus had stamped his file with a single word: liquidated. Case closed. Another escaped prisoner hunted down and eliminated in the endless white wasteland. Except they were wrong. Georgy Tenno had not died. He had simply vanished. But survival was only... He had walked 1,000 kilometers across the dead tundra, where winter never truly releases its grip and summer offers only brief, cruel teasing. He had built a raft from scraps and wreckage. He had crossed the Barents Sea, and then he had disappeared into a new identity for 14 years while the KGB tore the country apart, searching for him. The state security organs had declared him dead in 1950, filing away his case under the official classification of terminated during escape attempt. Dead men tell no tales. Dead men do not resurface. Dead men certainly do not return to their homeland 46 years later to embrace a wife who had long since remarried, twice, believing herself a widow. Dead men do not come back to tell stories that shatter the myth of an invincible Soviet punitive system. And yet here he stood, breathing, scarred, unbroken. In his weathered hands, Georgy clutched a battered notebook filled with handwritten entries. Page after page documented what no one was supposed to survive, what no official record would ever acknowledge. This tattered collection of notes was more than a diary. It was proof, evidence that the impossible could be achieved when a man wages everything, his body, his sanity, his very existence, against a system designed to grind human beings into dust. This story began not at a border crossing, but in a frozen barrack on a bitter March morning in 1946, when a 21-year-old Estonian first allowed himself to think the unthinkable. Georgy Tenno entered the world. Nothing about this ordinary family suggested that one of its sons would one day become a ghost who haunted the Soviet state for nearly half a century. Everything shattered in June of 1940. Soviet tanks rolled across the Estonian border, and the small nation vanished into the maw of the USSR. Georgy was 15 years old enough to understand what occupation meant, old enough to watch his world transform into something unrecognizable. Neighbors he had known his entire life began disappearing in the night, taken from their beds by men in uniforms who offered no explanations. Whispers replaced conversations. Fear became the air everyone breathed. The boy observed everything with eyes that would learn to miss nothing. His father, Georgy Tenno, received the first summons within weeks. The local gymnasium, where students once conjugated Latin verbs and debated philosophy, had been converted into NKVD headquarters. Andre was called in for questioning, then again, and again. Each time he returned home with fewer words and darker shadows beneath his eyes. The interrogators wanted names, confessions, evidence of anti-Soviet sentiment. They were building files on everyone. It was only a matter of time before those files demanded bodies to fill the camps. The hammer fell on the 17th of June, 1941, exactly 5 days before Germany would launch its invasion of the Soviet Union. Georgy woke to the sound of splintering wood as 3 NKVD officers kicked through the front door before dawn. They tore through the house with methodical violence, upending furniture, scattering belongings, searching for evidence of crimes that existed only in quotas and quotas alone. Georgy Tenno was dragged from his home in his nightclothes. The charge was standard issue: anti-Soviet agitation and assistance to bourgeois nationalists. The evidence against Georgy Tenno was breathtakingly thin. He had spoken with neighbors. He had mentioned, perhaps unwisely, that life had been better before the Soviets arrived. That was all. That was enough. Such conversations were not private exchanges between friends. They were crimes against the state, ammunition for informants who received rewards for each traitor they unmasked. The sentence came down with mechanical efficiency: 10 years in the labor camps. Georgy Tenno was swallowed by the system and would never emerge. His son would not learn his fate for many years. At 16 years old, Georgy became the eldest male in a household suddenly stripped of its protector. His mother aged years in days. His siblings looked to him with questions he could not answer. 1 week after his father's arrest, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and the world descended into chaos once more. But Georgy would remember this moment: the sight of his father being hauled away at dawn, the helplessness that burned in his chest for the rest of his life. It was the moment he first understood that the state could reach into any home, destroy any family, erase any life it chose, and there was nothing ordinary people could do except survive. The German Wehrmacht swept through Estonia with terrifying speed, and by early July of 1941, Soviet forces had retreated eastward. For the Tenno family, one occupation simply replaced another. The NKVD officers who had dragged Georgy away vanished overnight, replaced by German administrators who brought their own brand of order and their own lists of undesirables. Georgy watched the swastika rise over buildings that had flown the hammer and sickle just weeks before. The faces of the occupiers changed, but the weight of foreign boots on Estonian soil remained constant. 3 years of German occupation stretched before Georgy like an endless gray corridor. He was 17 when it began, 20 when it ended. The years that should have held university studies, first loves, the gradual unfolding of adult life. Instead, he found work as a mechanic at a factory the Germans had refurbished for their war effort. It was survival, nothing more. He repaired machines. He kept his head down. He joined no collaborationist militias, participated in no anti-partisan operations, attached himself to no Nazi auxiliary units. Many Estonians made different choices, seeing the Germans as liberators from Soviet terror. Georgy simply worked and waited for the madness to end. But the machinery of history cares nothing for individual intentions. What mattered to Georgy, that he had merely survived, merely existed, merely fixed broken equipment to feed his family, would matter not at all to the power that came next. The Red Army began its westward advance in 1944, and by autumn, Soviet forces were pouring back into Estonia. This time they came not as occupiers establishing control, but as victors reclaiming territory. And victors, Georgy would soon learn, demand accounting. Someone must answer for the years of German rule. Someone must pay. The 23rd of September 1944 arrived with autumn rain and a knock at the door that Georgy had been dreading for weeks. NKVD officers, new faces wearing the same cold expressions as those who had taken his father, presented themselves with documents and questions. Where had he worked during the occupation? What had he done? For whom? The factory records were thorough. The Germans had kept excellent files, and those files now belonged to Soviet intelligence. Georgy Tenno, age 19, had repaired machinery in a German-operated facility. That single fact sealed his fate. Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code was a masterpiece of totalitarian flexibility. Section 1A addressed treason against the motherland, a charge elastic enough to encompass nearly any behavior the state wished to punish. Working in a factory during occupation qualified perfectly. The military tribunal that processed Georgy's case spent less than 15 minutes on deliberation. The sentence landed like a hammer blow: 25 years of corrective labor. He was 19 years old. If he survived, and the odds were viciously against it, he would be released at 44, his youth entirely consumed by the camps. The statistics of the Gulag were not abstract numbers to those who entered its gates. Of every 100 prisoners transported to the camps of the extreme north, perhaps 30 would eventually return home. The remaining 70 would perish from exhaustion, disease, accidents, cold, or simply the slow starvation of inadequate rations. Their bodies would remain in the permafrost forever, unmarked and unmourned. Georgy understood these odds as the transport trains carried him eastward. 47 years later, almost to the exact day, he would present a passport at a border crossing in free Estonia. But between that September arrest and that September return lay a journey through hell itself. The journey to Vorkuta took 3 months. 3 months locked inside cattle cars with dozens of other prisoners, rolling endlessly eastward and then northward across the vast Soviet expanse. The train stopped for hours, sometimes days, at unnamed sidings. Food was delivered irregularly. Thin soup and black bread passed through gaps in the wooden slats. Men died during the transport, their bodies removed at stations by guards who recorded the losses with clerical indifference. Georgy pressed himself against the wall of the car and watched, listened, learned. The weak perished first. Survival required something harder than strength. It demanded the cold calculation of a man willing to outlast the system trying to kill him. On the 1st of December, 1945, the transport finally reached its destination. The prisoners were ordered out into a world that seemed designed by nature itself to destroy human life. The temperature that day hovered at -38 degrees. The air burned the lungs and froze nostril hairs solid with each breath. And above them, nothing. No sun, no light beyond the gray pallor of polar twilight. The long Arctic night had begun its reign, and the sun would not rise above the horizon again until the middle of January. Georgy stepped onto the frozen platform and understood that he had arrived at the end of the earth. Vorkutlag was not merely a prison camp. It was an industrial death machine built on permafrost, dedicated to extracting coal from the frozen ground regardless of human cost. The Soviet state needed fuel for its factories, heat for its cities, power for its reconstruction. The Arctic held vast coal deposits. All that was required was labor, endless, expendable labor drawn from the millions of prisoners the system produced each year. Whether those prisoners survived the extraction process was an accounting detail, nothing more. New transports arrived constantly to replace the fallen. The dead were replaced. The coal kept moving south. The mines themselves were monuments to human misery. Shafts plunged 800 meters into the earth, where temperatures climbed to 35 degrees and humidity reached 100%. Prisoners hacked at coal seams in suffocating heat, stripped to their underclothes, drenched in sweat. Then came the ascent, rising through the shafts to the surface, where Arctic winter waited with temperatures 60 or 70 degrees colder than the tunnels below. The thermal shock destroyed bodies with ruthless efficiency. Men developed pneumonia, tuberculosis, heart conditions. Lungs that had gasped in underground heat suddenly seized in frozen air. The weak collapsed within weeks. The strong lasted months, sometimes years. No one lasted forever. Georgy was assigned to Brigade 7 at Mine Number 7, one of the deepest and most dangerous shafts in the entire complex. His daily quota was set at 3 tons of coal per 12-hour shift. Meeting the quota meant survival rations, enough bread and soup to maintain a body capable of working. Falling short meant punishment rations, 300 grams of bread and watery soup made from rotting cabbage. The mathematics were merciless. On punishment rations, a man burned more calories working than he consumed eating. The body devoured itself. Death followed in 2 to 3 months, a gradual weakening that ended with a prisoner too feeble to lift his tool, then too feeble to stand, then simply gone. The quota was not a target, it was a death sentence with a timer. But Georgy Tenno possessed something that transcended physical endurance, the mechanical skills his father had taught him years ago in the railway yards of Rakvere. In the mines, equipment broke constantly. Jackhammers failed, drills seized, cutting tools shattered against the coal face. Most prisoners lacked the knowledge to repair such machinery. Georgy did not. He began fixing tools for other inmates in exchange for bread, for soup, for small advantages that accumulated into survival. He negotiated with brigade leaders, offering his repair skills in exchange for quota credits, work recorded in his name that he had not performed. It was corruption, bribery, the black economy of the damned. It was also the only path through the long polar night. 1 year passed in this frozen underworld. Georgy counted the days by the deaths around him. 23 men from his barracks perished during those 12 months, some from starvation's slow embrace, others from accidents in the mine shafts, still others from the tuberculosis that swept through the camp like an avenging plague, claiming entire barracks in its passage. Each death was a lesson. Each corpse carried away to the permafrost graves beyond the wire was a reminder. This place was designed to kill, and it was remarkably efficient at its purpose. Survival required more than endurance. It required a plan. And in March of 1946, a new arrival in Barracks 17 would provide exactly that. Boris Kravtsov arrived in Barracks 17 on a bitter March morning in 1946, and something about him immediately set him apart from the broken men who shuffled through Vorkutlag's gates. He was 38 years old, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command and the watchful eyes of someone who had spent years reading terrain and assessing threats. His file would have told the story to anyone with access. Former captain in the Red Army, military topographer who had served across the vast distances of the Far East, veteran of 2 wars. But files only captured facts. They could not convey the dangerous flame that still burned behind those calculating eyes. Kravtsov had survived the Finnish Winter War, where Soviet soldiers froze to death in their thousands against a tiny nation that refused to yield. He had fought through every year of the Great Patriotic War, advancing westward with the Red Army through landscapes of unimaginable carnage. He had walked into Berlin itself as a captain in military intelligence, part of the victorious force that planted the Soviet flag over the ruins of Hitler's Reich. 4 years of combat, countless battles, medals earned in blood. And then, in a single moment of vodka-fueled honesty, he had destroyed everything he had built. 1 sentence. That was all it took. The scene was a Victory Day banquet in May of 1945. Officers were drinking, celebrating, allowing themselves to believe the worst was over. Kravtsov raised his glass and spoke words that had been fermenting in his mind for years. A pity we defeated Hitler only to live under our own dictatorship. The table fell silent. Someone laughed nervously. But in the corner of the room, a military intelligence officer was already composing his report. Within a week, the decorated combat veteran was stripped of his rank. Within a month, he was on a transport heading north. His sentence? 10 years for anti-Soviet agitation. The state that he had served with his body and blood had devoured him without hesitation. Yet, unlike so many prisoners who arrived at Vorkutlag already broken in spirit, Kravtsov had not surrendered to despair. His military mind continued to function, analyzing the camp as if it were enemy territory to be studied and ultimately escaped. He observed guard rotations, noted shift changes, mentally mapped the surrounding terrain based on fragments of information gathered from other prisoners and his own topographical expertise. Most men in the Gulag thought only of surviving the next day, the next meal, the next quota. Kravtsov thought in longer arcs. He thought about the perimeter. He thought about the tundra beyond. He thought about possibilities that others had long since abandoned as suicidal fantasies. Georgy first noticed the new arrival during evening roll call, the way Kravtsov stood slightly apart, watching everything with those measuring eyes. Over the following days, their paths crossed in the mine shafts and the food line. Brief glances exchanged between men who recognized something in each other. Kravtsov was gathering information, Georgy realized, testing prisoners with careful questions, sorting the informants from the desperate, the broken from those who still harbored some flicker of resistance. It was dangerous work. Stukachi, informants, riddled every barracks, eager to trade fellow prisoners' secrets for an extra ration of bread. One wrong word to the wrong man meant an extended sentence or a bullet in a cold courtyard. On the 4th of April, 1946, Kravtsov made his approach. The polar night had finally released its grip on the Arctic. Each day now brought 8 additional minutes of pale sunlight, and the worst of winter was slowly retreating. The two men sat together in the canteen, surrounded by the noise of exhausted prisoners consuming their meager rations. Kravtsov spoke of inconsequential things, conditions in the mine, the quality of that day's soup, rumors about norm adjustments. Then his voice dropped to barely a whisper, his lips hardly moving as he leaned closer and posed a single question that would alter the trajectory of Georgy's entire existence. "Do you want to get out of here alive?" Georgy's instincts screamed caution. This was exactly how provocations began, a friendly approach, a dangerous question, and then the trap snapping shut as the informant reported another escape conspirator to the camp authorities. He studied Kravtsov's face, searching for the telltale signs of duplicity, the subtle satisfaction of a man about to betray a fellow prisoner. But he found nothing of the sort. What he saw instead was something far more unsettling, the absolute determination of a man who had already decided to risk everything, who would rather die in the frozen wilderness than spend another decade rotting in Soviet mines. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. And in that moment, Georgy recognized a reflection of his own desperate soul staring back at him. For 3 months following that whispered question in the canteen, Georgy and Kravtsov conducted the most dangerous conspiracy of their lives. They never met in obvious ways, never lingered together where informants might notice patterns emerging. Instead, they exchanged fragments of conversation in the chaos of shift changes, muttered sentences in the deafening roar of the mine shafts, brief words during the Kravtsov had studied every escape attempt he could learn about, piecing together information from prisoners who had witnessed failed breakouts or heard rumors of those who had tried. The pattern was always the same. Men fled south toward civilization, toward the railway lines that represented their only mental image of freedom. And the pattern of failure was equally consistent. Search parties knew exactly where to concentrate their efforts. Roads were blocked within hours. Patrols swept the predictable routes with dogs and rifles. Most escapees were recaptured within days. Those who evaded the hunters simply froze to death when winter caught them in the open. The South was a trap disguised as salvation, so Kravtsov proposed the unthinkable. They would travel north, not toward civilization, but away from it, not toward the railway lines and settlements where search parties would focus their attention, but into the empty vastness of the Arctic coast. Every instinct screamed against this logic. North meant deeper cold, harsher terrain, absolute isolation from any possibility of help. North meant the Barents Sea, whose frigid waters killed swimmers in minutes. North meant abandoning any hope of blending into populated areas or stowing away on trains. It was, by any rational measure, suicide, which was precisely why it might work. The former military topographer had assembled a mental map from fragments gathered over months of careful questioning. Approximately 200 kilometers north of the camp, along the Arctic coastline, lay an abandoned polar research station. Soviet meteorological outposts had been established across the northern territories during the 1930s, and some had been left to decay when funding dried up or personnel were reassigned. These forgotten installations sometimes contained supplies, equipment, and most crucially, boats or materials that could be fashioned into watercraft. If they could reach the station, they might find means to attempt what no Vorkutlag prisoner had ever accomplished: crossing the Barents Sea to reach foreign territory. The timing required precision measured in weeks, not days. Winter escape was impossible. The mathematics of cold guaranteed death within the first night for anyone caught in the open at -40 degrees. But summer presented its own cruel challenge. The white nights, when the sun barely dipped below the horizon and true darkness never fell. For weeks on end, the tundra lay exposed under perpetual twilight, offering no shadows for concealment, no cover of night for movement. Search parties could spot fleeing figures from kilometers away. Aircraft could sweep the landscape and pick out human shapes against the endless gray-green expanse. Summer visibility was a death sentence of a different kind. Kravtsov calculated their window with military precision. They would move in late July when temperatures climbed high enough to survive nights in the open and the tundra had thawed enough to permit passage through marshlands that became impassable bogs earlier in the season. They would travel during the brief periods of lowest light, navigating by landmarks Kravtsov had memorized from descriptions and his own understanding of Arctic geography. Food would be the critical factor. They needed to stockpile enough calories to sustain a journey of at least 3 weeks through terrain that offered almost nothing edible. Every gram of bread saved, every scrap of fat hidden away, became a deposit in the account of their survival. Georgy listened to the plan unfold across those 3 months of whispered exchanges, and with each new detail, the impossible began to seem merely improbable. Kravtsov's expertise transformed what had been a death wish into something resembling a military operation. Difficult, dangerous, likely fatal, but not guaranteed suicide. They began their preparations in earnest, hoarding food in tiny increments that would not be noticed, fashioning crude tools that could be concealed and carried, studying the guard rotations until they knew exactly when the gaps in surveillance occurred. The date was set for the 23rd of July, 1946. In less than 4 months, they would either break free from the frozen hell of Vorkutlag or die in the attempt. For both men, either outcome was preferable to the slow death that awaited them in mine number 7. The night of July 23, 1946, arrived with a pale amber light that refused to fully fade from the horizon. True darkness would not come. This far north, this deep into summer, the sun merely skimmed the edge of the world before beginning its ascent once more. Georgy and Kravtsov had spent 4 months preparing for this moment, hoarding scraps of bread dried into hardtack, secreting away fragments of fat and small amounts of salt, assembling the meager supplies that might sustain them across the vast emptiness ahead. Now the moment had arrived, and theory was about to collide with the brutal reality of the Arctic tundra. They slipped away during the confusion of a shift change, exploiting a gap in guard coverage that Kravtsov had identified through weeks of patient observation. The transition between night and day crews created 17 minutes of reduced vigilance along the eastern perimeter. 17 minutes during which attention focused inward on the prisoner count rather than outward toward the wire. It was enough. They crawled through a drainage channel that passed beneath the fence, their bodies pressed into freezing muck, hearts pounding against the earth. Behind them, the camp continued its grinding routine, unaware that 2 of its inmates had vanished into the endless north. The first hours were the most dangerous. Search protocols dictated immediate response once missing prisoners were identified at the next count, and the 2 men needed to put maximum distance between themselves and the camp before the alarm sounded. They moved at a pace just below a run, conserving energy while covering ground, navigating by the pale sun that hung eternally on the horizon. Kravtsov led, his topographical instincts guiding them across terrain he had only studied in his imagination. Behind them, kilometers falling away with each passing hour, Vorkutlag disappeared beyond swells in the tundra. They did not look back. The alarm would have been raised by noon the following day. 2 prisoners missing from count, last seen at evening meal, likely escape attempt in progress. Georgy could imagine the machinery of pursuit grinding into motion, search parties assembling, dogs being readied, patrol routes being established along the predictable southern corridors. Perhaps a few guards would be dispatched northward as a precaution, but the real resources would flow toward the logical escape routes. No one ran north. North was death. The search commanders would assume these prisoners had simply chosen a less obvious southern path, and by the time they realized their error, Georgy and Kravtsov intended to be far beyond reach. Days blurred into one another as they pushed deeper into the white void. The tundra revealed itself as a landscape of cruel contradictions, flat enough to see for kilometers, yet treacherous with hidden marshes that could swallow a man to his waist without warning. Mosquitoes descended in clouds so thick they darkened the air, crawling into ears and nostrils, maddening in their relentless assault. The men wrapped their faces in torn cloth and kept moving, rationing their precious food supplies with miserly precision, drinking from streams of snowmelt that cut through the permafrost. Each day survived was a small victory against odds that remained overwhelmingly hostile. Kravtsov's navigation proved remarkably accurate, despite working from memory and improvised dead reckoning. They followed river valleys where possible, using the watercourses as guides through otherwise featureless terrain. At night, though night was merely a slightly dimmer version of day, they rested in shallow depressions, covering themselves with scraps of cloth and whatever vegetation they could gather for concealment. Sleep came in fitful snatches, haunted by the constant fear of discovery, the ever-present hunger gnawing at their bellies. The 1,000-kilometer journey stretched before them like an infinite sentence, each step a word in a story that might never reach its conclusion. On the 12th day, they heard the helicopter. The sound reached them first as a distant mechanical heartbeat, then grew into an unmistakable roar as the aircraft swept across the tundra in a search pattern. They threw themselves into a shallow ravine, pressing their bodies against the cold earth, faces buried in moss and lichen. The helicopter passed overhead, so close that Georgy could feel the vibration in his chest, then continued its path toward the west. They lay motionless for an hour after the sound faded, hardly daring to breathe. The hunters were ranging farther north than expected. Time was running out. They rose from their hiding place and pushed onward with renewed urgency. The abandoned polar station still somewhere ahead in the endless. The Soviet meteorological outpost had been abandoned for at least a decade, left to decay when its purpose was exhausted and its personnel reassigned to other duties. Kravtsov had gambled everything on rumors and fragments of information, and now that gamble revealed its reward: shelter, potential supplies, and, most critically, the possibility of a vessel. They approached cautiously, weeks of flight having sharpened their instincts for danger, but the station was as dead as it appeared. Inside the main building, they discovered the remnants of scientific work long concluded: rusted instruments, scattered papers reduced to illegible pulp by moisture and time, a cast iron stove that still stood intact. In the storage shed beside the main structure, they found what they had crossed nearly 200 kilometers of hostile wilderness to obtain: wooden planks, rope, tar in sealed containers, the materials from which desperate men might fashion a craft capable of carrying them across the most unforgiving sea on Earth. For 6 days, Georgy and Kravtsov worked with frantic intensity. They cannibalized the station buildings for materials, tearing apart walls and salvaging every usable plank. Georgy's mechanical skills proved invaluable. He understood how joints needed to be fitted, where stress would concentrate, how to create a structure that might hold together against the assault of waves. They fashioned a crude raft approximately 3 meters long and 2 meters wide, binding the planks with rope and sealing the gaps with tar they heated over fires built from the station's scrap wood. It was an ugly, desperate creation, barely worthy of the name vessel, but it floated when they tested it in the shallows. It would have to be enough. The Barents Sea stretched before them like a gray eternity, its waters cold enough to kill an unprotected swimmer in minutes. Even in July, the temperature barely reached 7 degrees near the shore, and further out, where Arctic currents dominated, it dropped lower still. Kravtsov had calculated their course during the long trek north. They would aim for Spitsbergen, the Norwegian archipelago that lay roughly 500 kilometers to the northwest. Norwegian territory meant safety, neutrality, freedom from Soviet jurisdiction. It also meant crossing one of the most dangerous bodies of water on the planet in a handmade raft with no navigation instruments beyond the sun and stars. They launched on the 26th day after their escape, pushing the raft into waters that seemed to hunger for their destruction. The first hours were deceptively calm, gentle swells lifting and dropping their craft, the coastline slowly receding behind them until it disappeared entirely. They paddled with boards fashioned from the station's wood, taking shifts to maintain progress while conserving strength. Their remaining food was measured in days, not weeks. Fresh water was limited to what they had carried in salvaged containers. Every calculation pointed toward the same conclusion: they would either reach land within 2 weeks, or they would die on the open sea. On the third night, the storm found them. It came from the northeast with a fury that seemed personal, waves rising to heights that dwarfed their tiny craft, wind tearing at their bodies with frozen claws. They lashed themselves to the raft as it bucked and twisted, taking on water that they bailed with desperate hands. Georgy felt the cold penetrating deeper than he had ever experienced, a cold that bypassed skin and muscle and settled directly into bone. At some point during that endless night, his face pressed against the raft's icy planks, the temperature plunging to -42 degrees, the frost claiming its permanent mark. The scar that would identify him for the rest of his life was born in those howling hours between one wave and the next. How they survived that storm would remain unclear even in Georgy's own memory. Dawn found them still afloat, the raft battered but intact, both men alive, though hovering at the edge of hypothermia. They had been blown off course, but Kravtsov recalculated their position using the sun and adjusted their heading. Days passed in a blur of paddling, rationing, and fighting the constant cold that sapped their strength. Their food ran out. They caught a fish using hooks fashioned from wire, ate it raw because they had no means to make fire on the waterlogged raft. Land appeared on the 14th day, rocky shores rising from the gray sea like a promise. They had reached Spitsbergen. They had crossed the impossible water. Against every odd, against every logical expectation, 2 escaped prisoners from Vorkutlag had sailed the Barents Sea and touched the soil of freedom. Norwegian fishermen discovered them on a rocky beach in Spitsbergen, 2 emaciated figures barely clinging to life beside the wreckage of what had once been a raft. The men who found them could scarcely believe what they were seeing, human beings who had apparently crossed the Barents Sea on a collection of planks and rope, more dead than alive, but breathing nonetheless. Kravtsov was in worse condition, his body ravaged by exposure and starvation, drifting in and out of consciousness. Georgy retained enough strength to speak a few words, enough to make the fishermen understand that these were not shipwrecked sailors, but escaped prisoners from the Soviet Arctic. The impossible had been achieved. Now came the challenge of surviving its aftermath. The Norwegian authorities faced a diplomatic puzzle wrapped in a humanitarian crisis. 2 Soviet citizens had arrived on their territory under extraordinary circumstances, claiming to be escaped political prisoners. The Cold War was settling into its frozen patterns, and the relationship between Norway and its massive eastern neighbor required careful management. Repatriation was out of the question. Both men would face execution or decades of additional imprisonment if returned. But granting asylum to escaped Soviet prisoners carried its own complications. The Norwegians chose a quiet solution: medical treatment first, then discreet resettlement under new identities. The 2 men who had crossed the tundra and sea together would be separated, given fresh names, and scattered into new lives. Georgy Tenno ceased to exist. In his place emerged Lars Eriksson, a Norwegian identity built from carefully forged documents and an invented history. The transformation required more than paperwork. It demanded the complete burial of everything Georgy had been. His Estonian accent had to be softened, his Russian erased, his mannerisms adapted to fit a Scandinavian persona. He was settled in a small coastal town far from Oslo, far from anywhere Soviet intelligence might think to look for escaped prisoners. The Norwegian security services checked on him periodically during the first years, ensuring his cover remained intact, watching for any signs that Moscow had picked up his trail. Gradually, their visits became less frequent. Lars Eriksson was becoming real. The mechanical skills that had saved his life in Vorkutlag now provided his livelihood in freedom. Georgy, now Lars, established a small repair business, fixing engines and machinery for the fishing boats that sustained the local economy. His hands remembered their training even as his mind struggled to adapt to an existence without guards, without quotas, without the constant calculus of survival. He worked long hours, partly from necessity and partly because idleness invited memories he preferred to keep buried. At night, the dreams came regardless: frozen tunnels, the weight of coal, the howling storm on the Barents Sea. He would wake gasping in the darkness of his small apartment, uncertain for terrible moments which life was real and which was the nightmare. 3 years after his arrival in Norway, Georgy met Ingrid at a church social in the neighboring village. She was a teacher, 30 years old, with kind eyes and a quiet strength that reminded him of his mother. Their courtship was slow, complicated by the walls Georgy had built around his true self. He told her he was an Estonian refugee who had fled the Soviet occupation after the war. Technically true, if missing several crucial chapters. She accepted his reticence about the past, perhaps sensing wounds too deep to probe. They married in 1950, a small ceremony with few guests. When their first child was born the following year, Georgy held the infant and wept for the first time since leaving Vorkutlag. He had a family again. He had a life. But that life was built on foundations of carefully constructed lies. The KGB had not forgotten. Soviet intelligence maintained files on escaped prisoners, and the case of the two men who had vanished from Vorkutlag and apparently crossed the Barents Sea had attracted particular attention. The search continued through diplomatic channels, through networks of informants scattered across Scandinavia, through patient cross-referencing of refugee records and immigration documents. Georgy knew he could never fully relax, never completely trust that his new identity would hold against determined investigation. Every knock at the door triggered a spike of fear. Every official letter required examination for hidden threats. Every stranger who looked at him too long became a potential agent in his paranoid calculations. He had escaped the physical prison of the Gulag, but the psychological prison traveled with him, invisible bars that would never fully dissolve. 14 years passed in this shadow existence. Lars Eriksson became a respected member of his community, a reliable businessman, a devoted husband, and father of 2 children. Georgy Tenno remained buried beneath the surface, emerging only in nightmares and moments of unguarded memory. He never spoke of Estonia to his wife, never mentioned his parents or the father who had been dragged away by the NKVD, never acknowledged the existence of a young woman named Anna whom he had loved before the world collapsed. That past belonged to a dead man, and dead men kept their secrets. But the pull of home never fully released its grip. Somewhere in Soviet Estonia, people he had loved still lived and breathed and wondered what had become of the boy who had disappeared into the maw of the state. The ghost of Georgy Tenno was about to risk everything to find out. The year was 1961, and Georgy Tenno had been a ghost for 15 years. His Norwegian life as Lars Eriksson had settled into comfortable rhythms. The repair business prospered, his children grew strong and healthy. Ingrid remained the steady anchor of a household built on secrets she did not know she was keeping. Yet something had begun to stir in Georgy's chest, a longing that no amount of Scandinavian contentment could quiet. His mother had died without knowing her son survived. His father had vanished into the Gulag system, fate unknown. And Anna, the woman he had loved before the world shattered, still lived somewhere in Soviet Estonia, believing him dead for over a decade. The need to know, to see, to close the wounds of the past grew until it overwhelmed caution itself. He obtained a tourist visa through careful manipulation of his Norwegian identity, presenting himself as Lars Eriksson, a businessman with interest in potential trade opportunities in the Baltic Soviet republics. The application passed through Soviet consular channels without triggering alarms. The name meant nothing to the vast databases of state security, and Norwegian businessmen visiting Tallinn were uncommon but not unprecedented. On the 10th of December 1961, Georgy boarded a flight that would carry him back into the jaws of the system that had once tried to destroy him. It was an act of profound courage or profound madness, or perhaps both intertwined beyond separation. He was returning to a country where his true name appeared on death certificates and his face might still linger in the memories of those who had known him. Tallinn in winter was exactly as he remembered and entirely transformed. Soviet architecture had imposed its gray uniformity on streets he had once walked as a free young man. Statues of Lenin watched from public squares. Red banners proclaimed socialist achievements in a language of forced optimism. Yet, beneath the Soviet overlay, the bones of the Estonian city remained. The medieval spires, the cobblestone passages of the old town, the harbor where fishing boats still rocked against their moorings. Georgy walked these streets in a daze of recognition and estrangement, a revenant haunting the landscape of his stolen youth. Every corner held memories. Every face might belong to someone who would recognize him. He found Anna's address in a telephone directory at his hotel, her married name listed alongside a street in a residential district he did not know. She had wed in 1949, the same year Soviet authorities had officially declared Georgy dead. He learned she had married an engineer, born 2 children, constructed an entire life in the space where his memory should have been. For 2 days he debated whether to approach her at all. What right did a ghost have to disturb the peace of the living? What purpose would it serve to tear open wounds that had taken years to close? But the need proved stronger than the doubt. On December 15th, he stood outside her apartment building in the gray afternoon light, heart hammering against his ribs, unable to force his legs to climb the stairs. He climbed anyway. 3rd floor, apartment number 7. A wooden door like any other, behind which waited answers to questions he had carried for 16 years. His hand trembled as he pressed the bell. Footsteps approached from within. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 50s, her face lined by time, but her eyes still holding the warmth he remembered from their youth. Anna looked at the stranger on her threshold with polite confusion. She did not recognize him. How could she? The young man she had loved was dead, and the weathered figure before her bore the scars of a journey she could not imagine. Georgy drew a breath that felt like drowning in reverse and spoke the words that would shatter her understanding of the past 17 years. "Anna, it is me, Georgy." The color drained from her face like water from a broken vessel. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, her mouth forming words that produced no sound. This was impossible. She had received official notification. She had mourned. She had built a new life on the foundation of his death. Yet here he stood, speaking with a voice that memory confirmed even as reason rejected. Her hand rose slowly, trembling, and touched the scar that ran the length of his cheek, the mark of his impossible journey, the proof written in flesh that this apparition was real. "It is truly you," she whispered, and then the tears came, and Georgy held her in the doorway of her Soviet apartment while 16 years of grief and disbelief poured out between them. He had returned from the dead, but death, he would soon discover, was not finished reaching for him. They sat in her kitchen for an hour, 2 people separated by decades and circumstance, drinking tea from chipped Soviet cups while Georgy unspooled the impossible thread of his survival. He told her everything. The escape from Vorkutlag, the 1,000 kilometers of frozen tundra, the makeshift raft and the storm that had carved its signature into his face, the 14 years of hidden existence in Norway. Anna listened without interruption, tears flowing silently down her cheeks, her hands wrapped around her cup as if drawing warmth from the only stable thing in a world suddenly turned upside down. When he finished, she told him her own story. 3 years of waiting, daily visits to the post office hoping for letters that never came, then the official death notification that had finally severed hope from its anchor. She had married Andrei in 1949, a good man, an engineer who had offered stability and kindness to a young widow who was not technically a widow at all. They had built a life together, 2 children, Mikhail and Elena, a modest apartment, the quiet contentment of Soviet domesticity. She had been happy, or had convinced herself she was happy, because the alternative was unbearable grief. Now the foundation of that happiness had cracked, revealing the living ghost of her first love sitting across her kitchen table. Georgy took her hand and spoke carefully, knowing each word carried weight. He had not returned to destroy what she had built. He, too, had married, had children, had constructed a life in Norway that depended on his remaining Lars Eriksson. He had come only to close the past, to see her face once more, to know that she had survived. Their farewell was tender and final, 2 people acknowledging a love that had never truly died while accepting that their paths had diverged beyond reunion. Georgy left her apartment building with a strange peace settling over his heart, the open wound of his youth finally beginning to close. But he had made a fatal error. Somewhere in the chain of his visit, perhaps a neighbor who remembered his face from 2 decades past, perhaps a suspicious clerk who noted the Norwegian passport and filed a report, perhaps even Anna herself mentioning the miraculous return to someone who whispered to someone else, information had begun flowing toward the organs of state security. On the 3rd day after their meeting, Georgy noticed the surveillance. 2 men in identical gray overcoats appeared wherever he went. They made no effort at subtlety. This was not careful intelligence work, but deliberate intimidation, a message that he had been identified and was being watched. Georgy recognized the technique from stories traded in Vorkutlag, the way the KGB announced its presence before closing the trap. His Norwegian passport offered some protection. Arresting a foreign businessman required justification and paperwork. But if they established his true identity, if they connected Lars Eriksson to the escaped prisoner Georgy Tenno, who was officially dead and therefore officially a non-person, that protection would evaporate like morning frost. He had perhaps hours before they assembled enough evidence to act. On the evening of December 18th, the knock came. Two men in civilian clothes stood in the corridor outside his hotel room, their faces carrying the blank professionalism of security operatives worldwide. They requested that Citizen Eriksson accompany them for a conversation regarding the purpose of his visit. Routine questions, they assured him, a minor formality. Georgy knew that such conversations occurred in basement rooms from which foreign businessmen did not return. He asked for one moment to collect his documents, closed the door, and felt 16 years of survival instinct surge through his body. The window offered his only exit. His room was on the second floor. Below, a snowdrift promised uncertain cushioning. He grabbed his passport and money, hurled his suitcase through the glass, and followed it into the freezing night. The fall knocked the breath from his lungs, but the snow absorbed enough impact to leave him functional. He heard shouting from above, then a gunshot that cracked through the winter air. A warning or a miss, he never knew which. Georgy ran through the dark streets of Tallinn, the city of his youth transformed into a maze of shadows and danger. His body remembered how to flee, how to double back, how to use darkness and confusion as allies. He made for the harbor, where he had noticed a Finnish cargo vessel during his wanderings. 19 hours he spent hidden in the freezing hold among timber containers, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. When the ship reached international waters, he emerged and surrendered to a startled captain, offering his Norwegian passport and a story about political complications. By December 21st, Georgy Tenno had escaped the Soviet Union for the second time, but he knew with cold certainty that he could never risk returning while that empire still stood. 30 years of silence followed his second escape. Georgy returned to Norway, to Ingrid and the children who knew him only as Lars Eriksson, and finally unburdened himself of the secret he had carried throughout their marriage. He told his wife everything: the arrest at 19, the frozen hell of Vorkutlag, the impossible crossing that had delivered him to Norwegian shores, the false identity that had sheltered their entire life together. Ingrid listened as Anna had listened, with tears and disbelief, but also with a dawning understanding that illuminated years of mysterious behavior. The nightmares that seized him in darkness, the flinch at unexpected knocks, the way he studied every official document as though it might contain a death sentence, all of it finally made sense. She could have felt betrayed. Instead, she held him and whispered that she understood. Their marriage, built on necessary lies, somehow grew stronger in the light of terrible truth. The decades that followed were quiet ones, the peaceful autumn of a life that had known more than its share of storms. Georgy and Ingrid raised their children, watched them marry and produce grandchildren, grew old together in the small coastal town that had sheltered a fugitive and transformed him into a neighbor, a friend, a fixture of the community. Lars Eriksson became more real with each passing year, while Georgy Tenno faded into a memory that surfaced only in dreams and private moments of reflection. He followed news from the Soviet Union with the attention of a man tracking the health of a former tormentor, noting each development, each sign of weakness in the system that had tried to crush him. He waited, though he could not have said precisely what he was waiting for. The answer came in August of 1991, delivered through television screens that showed crowds dismantling the architecture of Soviet power. The coup against Gorbachev failed. The republics declared independence one after another, dominoes falling in reverse. On the 20th of August, Estonia proclaimed its sovereignty restored after 51 years of occupation. The KGB was dissolved, its files scattered, its authority evaporated overnight. The empire that had consumed Georgy's father, stolen Georgy's youth, and hunted Georgy across continents had collapsed into history. The prison doors stood open at last. The guards had abandoned their posts. For the first time in 46 years, Georgy Tenno could reclaim his name without fear of consequence. On September 23, 1991, 47 years to the day after NKVD officers had arrested a 19-year-old mechanic for the crime of surviving occupation, Georgy Tenno boarded a flight to Tallinn with Ingrid beside him. His Norwegian wife had insisted on accompanying him for this final journey, this closing of a circle that had begun before she was born. He traveled under his true name for the first time in nearly half a century, documents that acknowledged the identity he had buried so deep and so long. The passport control officer who examined his papers could not have understood the weight of that moment, an old man returning home, unremarkable among the streams of travelers moving through the newly opened borders. But for Georgy, each stamp on that passport was a declaration of victory over forces that had once seemed invincible. Journalists awaited him at Tallinn airport, alerted by Estonian historians who had pieced together the extraordinary story of the Vorkutlag escape. Cameras flashed and microphones thrust forward, hungry for the details of a journey that had already passed into legend. Estonian television would produce a documentary about his life, transforming the private survival of one man into a national symbol of resistance against Soviet oppression. But before the interviews, before the ceremonies and commemorations, Georgy had a pilgrimage to complete. He traveled to the cemetery where his parents lay buried, knelt before their stones, and spoke aloud for the first time since his arrest. "I am Georgy Tenno, your son. I survived. Forgive me for not being there." The wind carried his words across the graves of a nation that had endured occupation and emerged, like him, into unexpected freedom. He found Anna again, now 67 years old and widowed, her engineer husband having passed some years before. They met at the same cafe where they had once sat as young lovers planning futures that history would not permit. Two elderly people examining the ruins and reconstructions of lives shaped by forces beyond their control. She told him that she had never stopped loving him, that even through her marriage and motherhood, a part of her heart had remained faithful to the memory of the young man who had been torn away. "Love does not die," she said, her voice soft with decades of waiting, "even when people are torn apart. When you returned in 61, I finally understood that truth." They parted as friends who had once been everything to each other, their story complete at last, the unfinished chapter finally granted its closing words. Georgy Tenno lived another 18 years, surrounded by family, embraced by two nations that claimed him as their own. He passed away peacefully in Norway in 2009 at the age of 84, his body finally surrendering to the time that Vorkutlag had failed to steal. His will contained a final request that surprised no one who knew his story: cremation and the scattering of his ashes over the Barents Sea. Not a burial in Norwegian soil, not a grave in Estonian earth, but dissolution into the gray waters that had nearly claimed his life and ultimately delivered his freedom. There, where he had fought the storm that scarred his face and forged his legend, the last physical traces of the man who escaped the Gulag would return to the element that had carried him to liberty. Today, a memorial plaque bears his name in Tallinn, mounted on a wall in the old town where he once walked as a free young man before the darkness descended. In Vorkuta itself, where the abandoned mines still scar the Arctic landscape, historians have erected a monument to the countless souls who attempted to flee the frozen camps, the desperate, the brave, the determined who chose uncertain death in the wilderness over certain destruction behind barbed wire. Most of those names are forgotten, their stories dissolved into the permafrost alongside their bones. But Georgy Tenno's name endures, carved in stone and preserved in memory. Each year on July 23rd, the anniversary of that impossible escape, enthusiasts and historians gather to retrace his journey and honor his memory. They speak of the 1,000 kilometers crossed on foot through mosquito-plagued tundra, the raft built from salvaged planks and desperate hope. the 14 years of shadow existence under a borrowed name, the second escape through a hotel window into snowy Tallinn streets, and the final triumphant return when the empire crumbled and the ghost reclaimed his identity. They speak of what one human being can accomplish when surrender is not an option, when the will to live burns hotter than the fear of death, when freedom becomes not a distant dream, but an immediate necessity worth any price. Georgy Tenno proved what the Soviet state spent 7 decades denying, that no system, however brutal, however vast, however seemingly omnipotent, can extinguish the flame of human determination. The Gulag was designed to break spirits and consume bodies, to transform human beings into expendable units of labor and then discard them into frozen anonymity. It succeeded millions of times over, but not always, not completely, not with everyone. Some few carried within them a fire that refused to die, and Georgy Tenno was among that stubborn, extraordinary number. His life stands as testimony to an eternal truth. The impossible is merely the possible waiting for someone brave enough to attempt it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage can triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds, then perhaps you will explore other tales of remarkable human endurance on this channel, stories of those who refused to accept the limits others placed upon them. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds to the living memory of those who struggled and survived. And if Georgy Tenno's journey from the frozen depths of Vorkutlag to the freedom of the open sea deserves to be heard by others, a simple click will help carry his story forward. Some escapes, after all, should never be forgotten.